Okay, good morning. Thank you, Nikki, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you, but I want to thank you for coming to spend a day of your time, investing a day of your time to learn more about the water resources, watersheds, riparian areas in Texas. My name is Steve Nelle. I'm not from around here. I'm from San Angelo. I spent the previous 35 years of my life working for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we were just getting started with a lot of good riparian work, and I retired, and so I decided I wanted to stay active in this because it's so important, and so that's why I'm here today. So I'm just going to take up where Nikki sort of left off. I'll try to stand back here so I don't block anyone's view. Lyndon B. Johnson, way before he became president, of course, was a landowner. And here's a quote that I found very interesting. He said, way back a long time ago, all my life I have drawn sustenance from the rivers and from the hills of my native state. I want no less for all the children of America than what I was privileged to have as a boy. Well, we may not all agree with his politics, but you'd have to agree that that's an excellent way of looking at natural resources, and it's something that we can all embrace. Here's another quote from LBJ. He said that saving the water and the soil must start where the first raindrop falls. So the entire landscape is involved in the water picture of Texas, not just the creeks and the rivers, the whole landscape as Nikki described. And this is what Texans want. They want healthy waters and abundant waters. That's what we all want, but that's what seems to be so elusive to us, and there's so many challenges. And we're not just talking about surface waters, we're talking about also groundwater and the water that flows in creeks and rivers across the state. And this is a lesson, or this is a truth that all Texans need to understand, that water comes from the land. Now, I'll describe what I mean by that later, but water doesn't come from your local utility company or from some agency or some water control district. It essentially comes from the land. It's a product of the land, just like corn and cattle and any other agricultural commodity. It has been stated that those who do not understand nature are destined to deplete it. And I believe there's at least some truth to that statement. But the purpose of this workshop and many others like it across the state is a little different. And it's those who understand nature the best are compelled to conserve it. They're not forced to conserve it. They're not regulated. They're not paid necessarily some monetary return, but they're compelled to conserve it because they want to, because they know how important it is. And so keep that in mind as we continue today. And I think one of the reasons you're here is to understand this aspect of nature a little bit better. And the men and women who manage and conserve and who understand the land for these benefits are what we call land stewards. And one of our goals is, of course, to help stimulate more and more landowners to become true, genuine land stewards. Well, here's a question that I think you already know the answer to. And what are the only two things that happen to water the moment that the rainfall hits the ground? Well, Nikki already really talked about it, but it either soaks in or it runs off. And understanding that simple contrast right there is a lot of our conservation efforts. We really want to encourage, to the extent possible, for water to soak into the ground. That's sort of the natural example of the way it should be. Here's another question that I think you know the answer to. Nikki defined what a watershed is, that unit of land that funnels surface runoff downhill into tributaries and creeks. But she also mentioned that a watershed should function to catch water. And so we have sort of taken on the task of trying to get people to think about the land as a water catchment, not a watershed. A watershed is something like the roof of a barn that sheds water and repels water. And so we want to get people to thinking along the lines of the land as something that catches and holds the water. And you've all seen these water-shedding landscapes all across Texas. This is not because of drought. This is because the water cycle is dysfunctional. It's not being managed well. And so even a fairly modest rain begins to run off. The soil is not working the way it's supposed to. It's not absorbing water. It's not holding water. And then you've seen water-catching landscapes. This is sort of the goal, for land to absorb and hold and catch water. And when it rains, even when it rains hard, the soil is soaking in water. Nikki mentioned the concept of a sponge. So think of the landscape as a big absorbent sponge holding and storing water. And so these water catching landscapes combined with good land stewardship is really what helps to protect and process the waters of Texas. This is what we mean when we say water comes from the land, because the land first absorbs the rainfall, even large, heavy rainfall. It stores the water in the soil. The soil is functional. The soil has good structure, good organic matter. It absorbs it like a sponge and then releases that water in moderation, more slowly over time, for a more even distribution. Instead of big flushing, gushing, we have more even distribution. And this helps to maintain higher quality water, and it helps to sustain the flow of springs and creeks and rivers, even in dry times. And sometimes we see a water shedding landscape and a water catching landscape right next to each other. And I took this picture many years ago when I worked in Gonzales, just one of your neighboring counties. But I hope that your property is pictured by the left side of the fence. And I hope that more and more over time, more landowners and land operators will begin to see the problems with managing land to shed water. This land over here is really much more drought prone. In fact, we say that land like this tends to be in a perpetual drought. No matter how much it rains, it's just not working right because it's not absorbing water. So I think all of these things so far you understand. They're kind of common sense and intuitive to landowners. But what you may not have ever thought about is that creeks and rivers operate the same way. We have some creeks that we might call water-shedding creeks. There's a water-shedding creek. It acts more like a drainage ditch than a creek. And we have water-catching creeks. Do you see the difference? Water up here just flows as fast downstream as gravity will allow. There's nothing to slow it down. There's nothing to catch and hold sediment compared to this water-catching creek, where when the creek gets on a rise, that water spreads out in that vegetation and it's slowed down and it catches sediment, and it's actually storing water in this whole riparian area, and there's very little water storage going on here. So think of creeks also as being either water shedding creeks or water catching creeks. And so I want to begin by asking each of you to think about this question. What are some of the things that you most value and appreciate about a healthy creek and riparian area? I'm going to give you just a few moments to think about that from your own perspective. What are the things that you most value and appreciate? And the answer to that question is going to vary, because different people have different things that they value about creeks and rivers, and that's okay. The gentleman on the lower picture raises cattle on a large South Texas ranch, and he appreciates the livestock forage. The people at the top of the picture probably have some different things that they value, and they're all important. And if we took the time to go around the room, I think the list of things that we value would go something like this. People want clean water, high quality water. They want reliable supplies of water over time. If you're in the ranching business, you appreciate the forage, the livestock forage, certainly the fish and aquatic life, the wildlife habitat, and then those intangible things that we appreciate, the natural beauty and the recreation and the aesthetics. They're all important, but that's not the primary subject of today's workshop. Today, we're going to ask you to lay aside some of those values that you cherish, because today, at least during this presentation, our goal is for us to come to a better understanding of creeks and rivers and how they work. And so let's make sure we're all on the same page by a definition. A riparian area is simply the transition area between the dry uplands that Nikki talked about and the water itself. So it's very clearly depicted here. This is a West Texas scene. Your riparian areas look a little different, but it's the same definition. It's that transition zone between the drier parts of the landscape and the wet part. No matter where you're at on the planet, riparian areas operate under the interaction of these three forces. We're going to talk about all three sides of that triangle this morning. But really, this dynamic is expressed a little better if you think of it as a series of intermeshing gears. Think of it, it's sort of like a machine. Work, energy, movement. It's dynamic. And so if the riparian area is or can be likened to a machine, then we might ask the question, how would we define or describe a properly functioning riparian area? And here is the definition that we can use to help us understand when a riparian area is functioning correctly. It would have adequate vegetation or landscape formation or large woody material to do these following things. First and foremost, to dissipate the energy of that stream, especially during high flow events. Think of these floods that come through these creeks. Dissipating that energy, helping to stabilize banks and protect the channel, reducing erosion. And then when you dissipate the energy of moving water, you slow the water down. And what happens to sediment when you slow down the velocity of water? Some of the sediment drops out. And so we see a trapping of sediment along the edges of the riparian area. And this is what we call the floodplain. The floodplain is composed of those sediments. And the floodplain sediments store large volumes of water. So again, we're thinking of this sponge. We're thinking of storing and catching water. And we also see that there's large amounts of floodwater retention when those creeks get on a big rise and they spread out. Vast volumes of floodwater are retained temporarily out in the floodplain, which reduces the damaging of some flooding. We get large amounts of groundwater recharge when those waters are spread out. And all of these things together is what helps to sustain the base flow of these creeks during the dry times. And you all know about dry times. We've been through historic droughts, and yet many creeks continued to flow. And it's kind of a miraculous thing to see. But anyway, continuing on here, when these factors are in place, we say that we have a healthy or properly functioning riparian area. And then is when we have the capacity for all of the qualities that or the values that we said we wanted. The water quality, the water quantity, all of these things that we say we want from a creek, the forage, the aquatic habitat, the wildlife, all of these values over here only can happen when these things are in good working order. And so the take-home message here is that the physical processes, the physical function is what provides the values, not the other way around. So if you want water quality, if you want good fish habitat, if you want good cow habitat, think about dissipating energy, slowing down the water, protecting the banks, trapping sediment, all of these things. Well, obviously Texas has some extreme water challenges ahead of us, and you can look in any newspaper on nearly any day and you see stories and discussions on our water crisis and some of the solutions that are still being talked about on a daily basis is let's build more dams, we need more reservoirs, we need to dredge the sediments out of our old reservoirs because they've silted up. We can exploit aquifers and drill wells and pipe that water from point A to point B, desalinization. Certainly water conservation is an important part of the equation. Some people believe that brush control may have a role to play in helping to solve our water challenges, and so perhaps all of these might be parts of the puzzle. But to a large extent, policymakers are overlooking an important opportunity because Texas has 190 some odd thousand miles of creeks and rivers, and there's an overlooked opportunity that most people have not yet thought about, and that opportunity to help us address Texas water challenges is the opportunity of catching the water in the land, storing the water in the land. What you see here are two pictures of the same exact location about 20 years apart. The upper photo is just a dry arroyo. It's in one of the western states. The lower photo, you say, what happened? Well, they didn't dam it up. They didn't pipe water in there. The land has been transformed by management to be a water-catching, water-holding landscape. And so we have large amounts of water being stored here in this riparian area. Likewise here, the upper picture shows a big, wide, dry valley. There's a little bit of a trickle of a creek running through here. You can barely see it, but the valley is dry. It's not catching any water. Same exact photo on the bottom, a big, wide, wet, holding large volumes of water down in the valley, in the water table. So we, again, think of this term riparian sponge to help depict the water storage that can take place in the area adjacent to creeks and rivers. And we don't have to be in a high rainfall area for this to be illustrated. Here's a poor little creek in Arizona. This area gets 6 inches on average. And you can see poor little Burro Creek. There's a little bit of trickle here, not even enough for a burro to drink. It's a water-shedding landscape. They may get there 6 inches all in 1 week. You know how that's how it is in the desert. But someone made the decision to change the way the landscape is managed. And 20 years later, without planting anything, nothing was planted in any of the pictures I'm going to show you. It all happened naturally. And look at Burro Creek 10, 20 years later. It's a water-holding, a water-catching environment. No dams were built. No dirt work was done. No water was piped in. The land is now functioning the way it's supposed to, and it's holding and catching water. And so today, during this presentation and others, we're going to sort of dissect a creek and try to answer this question. How and why does a creek operate and function the way it does? We're going to dissect it, look at the parts, try to understand the function of the parts. And so if you look at this picture of a creek, it's obviously sort of a hill country creek, which look a little different than your creeks, but they operate under the same principles. But what are some of the components and parts of the creek that you see there? Well, we have a channel that's confined by the banks, so there's 2 parts. We have a floodplain, clearly shown here, which is made of sediment. So the sediments are part of the creek system. We have the normal base flow. That's where the fish live. That's where the cows drink. That's where you throw rocks. But hopefully once every year or two, we have a nice rain up on the water catchment, and we get a little flood move through there. So flooding is a part of the creek. It's not something that happens to a creek. It's part of the creek. And then there's water that's underground that we can't see. There's a water table that's under the sediments. And it's actually the same water, as Nikki described, that we see here in the channel. This base flow is connected to and attached to the water table. There's an intimate connection between those three aspects of water. And then there's the vegetation, which we'll talk about later. It's not pictured here, but we have in many creeks large woody material that gets lodged and hung up in creeks, and we'll talk about that some, the importance of that, organic debris. And so you see some of the parts and components of a creek, but then if you think about some of the dynamics and processes that happen, which we won't talk about those in any detail, but it shows you exactly what Nikki said, how complex riparian areas are and watersheds. There's a lot of stuff going on in these riparian areas. And the things that we're going to talk about today, they apply to the very smallest headwater creeks that you may have way back in the hills. It applies to the tributary creeks. It applies to the larger rivers. This is the lower Guadalupe down near Victoria, where all your water drains. It applies to heavily wooded creeks and rivers, and it applies to creeks and rivers that are not so heavily wooded. And what we're saying is that no matter what your creeks look like, the principles we'll talk about today apply, even though your creeks may look a little different than some of the pictures we're going to show. We oftentimes get asked out to a property, and we'll be taken to a creek, and they'll say, "Look at that creek. It's something wrong with it. It's not working right." And we'll be asked, "How in the world should we fix this creek?" And we're not going to tell anybody specifically how to fix their creek today, because every creek is a little different. But what we are going to do is explain the process, the natural process by which creeks tend to fix themselves. Natural regeneration, natural restoration, if we'll just allow that to happen. And to illustrate this is a series of pictures taken by this gentleman, whose name is Wayne Elmore. Mr. Elmore was formerly with the National Riparian Service Team, and his team came to Texas on many, many occasions over the last 10 years, training us on the things that they had learned up in Oregon and Washington and Idaho and Colorado and other states over the past 30 years. By the way, Texas is at least 20 or 30 years behind many other states in understanding how these riparian areas work. So we have a lot of catching up to do, and Mr. Elmore came down and helped us try to understand how these things work. Notice that this is in a 12-inch precip zone, so it's not a wet place. These principles work in wet environments and dry environments. He took a series of pictures at the same location of Bear Creek. And here's what Bear Creek looked like in 1977. It's kind of a poor-looking creek. Central Oregon, the dry part of Oregon. The creek had eroded down to solid bedrock, is what you see there. It's intermittent flow, lots of erosion, not much vegetation, looks pretty poor. There's two things that contributed to Bear Creek looking the way it does. And one was essentially 100 years of what we would call unmanaged grazing. And by that I mean that the grazer, the permittee who leased that land, put X number of cows in his pasture. And guess what cows do if they're allowed to? Where do they want to stay most of the time? Right down by the creek. You've seen it. They're going to hang out in that creek area unless you change that management. And so 100 years of unmanaged grazing, and on top of that, prior to the 1950s, that entire valley of Burro Creek was comprised of willow trees and willow brush. It was so thick that cowboys couldn't ride through it. And in the 1950s, a government agency thought it would be a darn good idea to spray the willow trees, because everybody knows how much water willow trees use up. And they thought, if we just kill the willow, then the creek will start flowing again. And that was the prevailing thought back then. So they sprayed the willow trees and they killed every last one of them. And then several years went by, and in 1964 the whole region got abnormally heavy rains during 1 year. 1964. A lot of flooding, a lot of runoff. Without the willow brush to dissipate the energy of the floodwaters, without the roots of the willow trees to hold the banks in place and to hold the floodplain in place, Burro Creek blew out down to solid bedrock in one season. The bottom of Burro Creek didn't used to be down here. It used to be up here some 3 to 4 to 5, in places 8 foot higher than what you see in this picture. That's what led to Burro Creek being in that condition. And so here's just a few of the statistics that were measured at the beginning of this series of pictures. A pretty poor situation. And the only thing that was done on Burro Creek, a decision was made to change how livestock were grazed. Nothing else was done. Nothing was planted. And the change that they did was, at first, they reduced the number of livestock drastically to try to jumpstart the vegetation. And so for several years, they greatly reduced the number of livestock that grazed. But beginning in 1985 and continuing now, they still graze it. But they don't graze it year long. They graze it what we sometimes call flash grazing, where they put the entire herd in the creek pasture for a short period of time. And now we're talking perhaps 10 days to 2 weeks. A lot of head for a short period of time. And then they move them to another part of the creek for another 2 weeks. And then another part of the creek for 2 more weeks. And then back up into the hills for the rest of the year. More about that later. And so this series of pictures, this tree is present in every photo just to show you that it's the same creek. But here's what it began to look like by 1983. Obviously a little bit of a high flow moving through there, but what we see happening as a result of this change in grazing management, first we see that this slope is developing its own natural angle, which is good. We see some vegetation beginning to form on the inside bend here. We see a large amount of sediment that is becoming deposited and trapped on top of the bedrock, being established by the vegetation. We see a line of vegetation forming on this outside bend. So some good things starting to happen by 1983. And then a continuation of those good things. By 1986, it doesn't look like the same creek, but there's that tree. And what is happening is vegetation was allowed to grow. The vegetation trapped sediment. That sediment then allowed more vegetation to grow. So it's a back and forth tennis game of more vegetation gives more sediment. More sediment grows more vegetation. That vegetation traps more sediment. So every time the creek gets on a rise, it's trapping sediment, it's building banks, it's building its own floodplain. The channel is narrowing, so it's a narrower, deeper channel. And we have a riparian sponge working, and we have energy dissipation taking place. All of those good things we described are starting to take place. 1986. 1987. What's your gut feeling? Doesn't look so good, does it? Where did all that good vegetation go? It's still there. that vegetation has trapped anywhere from 6 to 8 inches of sediment that came down in a flood. And the vegetation is now underneath the mud, and this is how creeks fix themselves. They trap the sediment from upstream. June of 1987, 2 months later, you begin to see the vegetation growing up through the mud. Riparian vegetation is adapted to growing up through being buried in sediment. That's what it does. August of 87, 1988, all of the vegetation has now assimilated all of that mud and sediment and silt into its banks. And if the creek could speak, it would say, "Thank you. I needed all of that sediment to build my banks, to narrow the channel, to create more water storage capacity." So there's 1988. There's 93. They had a drought, just like we have droughts. The water went under the surface. You can't see any flow. Droughts, however, can be an important time for riparian vegetation to actually improve, which seems counterintuitive, but what happens when the water table has recedes, the vegetation puts all of its energy into growing roots. And the natural, if you want to call it the instinct of plants, is to continue to grow their roots downward, 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 to stay in touch with the receding water table. That's what they do. And so the plant growth went into overdrive, the root systems, growing the roots downward and actually growing the roots horizontally also underneath the channel. And so what used to be a water-flowing channel is now a place where these roots can grow and reinforce those sediments on top of the bedrock. And so we get actually vegetation enhancement during these dry times, as long as we have a water table there to sustain the plants. A few years later, a flood. This was a 75-year flood event, so a very substantial flood event coming through. We're always wondering what kind of damage are we going to see when that water recedes. So there's February of 96, 2 months later. You can't even tell that a major flood went through there because the area is now stabilized. It's functional. The vegetation is strong enough to hold up to those high flows. And you can see that a bit more sediment was caught. Perhaps some areas washed out, but the vegetation is now growing back through that sediment. Again, just this same back and forth pattern that we have between floods and droughts and normal times. And here's what it looks like on graph paper. This is a cross-section, an engineering survey at that photo point of Burro Creek at the beginning of the photography, 1977. Here's the vertical bank. Here's the rock bottom channel. Here's the intermittent flow shown in blue. They resurveyed that exact same line in 1983, and you can see how much sediment has been caught by the vegetation because the grazing management was changed. You can see that the dimensions of the channel are narrower and deeper. That's much better for most fish species to have a narrower, deeper, cooler water rather than shallow flow. Resurveyed the same survey in 2001, the green line, and again, see how much more sediment was caught. See how the channel was narrowed. Everything between the green line and the first survey red line is sediment which has been trapped and captured by the creek, by the floodplain. But the most amazing thing about this graph is the fact that the bottom of the channel right there is now sitting 2 feet above solid rock. Now, how does that happen? How does the bottom elevation of a creek rise in elevation above the bedrock? And the answer is one word. It's roots. The root systems of that vegetation has so reinforced those sediments, those fine sediments, that they can resist the force of flowing water. And so the bottom of the creek has risen. And now there's a water table, and now there's a riparian sponge, and now there's perennial flow. Here's some of the statistics that they measured as a result of these observations. Caught a lot of sediment that didn't go into the reservoir. The size of the riparian sponge increased either threefold. There was a large net gain in water storage capacity, 5 acre-feet of storage per mile in the riparian sponge, not in the channel, but in the floodplain. Perennial flow, good trout habitat. The rancher's happy as can be because instead of having to buy hay to keep his cows fed through the winter, he now grazes this as standing hay in February and March. So he saves himself a lot of hay cost. So he's happy with it. Much less bank erosion. And so there's what 10 years of management did on Burro Creek. That's not to say that all creeks respond in that same time frame. Some are slower, some are faster. And your creeks look different than Burro Creek. And the creeks that I work with in West Texas look a little different. But the principles are the same, and they apply no matter where you're at. Here's an interesting series of pictures that you may see more than once today. But this is a photo point on the Nueces River taken by Sky Louie, who's the one who produced the Riparian Plant Field Guide. And she has been, over the last 10 or 12 years, the most active and successful advocate for riparian conservation and education in the state. And she's the one who sort of stimulated me to let's start teaching this stuff and let's start getting people involved in their creeks. And so she has taken, I'm not sure what's going on there. Nikki, do you know anything about that? I'm a complete dunce when it comes to computers and electronic devices. I've got to have young people up here to thank you, Ryan. I don't know what to do without you guys. But so that's what her photo point. This is on her home place where she lives. She's known this creek, this river, since she was a kid. And so look at that picture, 2007. Doesn't look too bueno. 1 year later, starting to change, starting to see some vegetation. 1 year later, you say, wow, how can that be? These were dry years. Again, how can this happen so quickly? This is natural restoration taking place. You remember 2011, don't you? How many of you remember 2011? Well, there's the Nueces River in 2011. No water, but look at the vegetation. There's a water table there. Those sycamore trees are still growing like gangbusters. 2012. And so you have to be amazed at the speed of which many riparian areas will respond to a change in management. And the good stuff happens during a flood. We should embrace and enjoy and appreciate floods because that's when the good things happen. When that water spreads out over the floodplain, and especially when there's vegetation to catch and trap that sediment. There's two important things that we can all remember about how riparian areas can be restored and maintained. And Nikki's already mentioned it, but I'm going to say them again. The first one is a mindset. It's the mindset that creeks and riparian areas are special places, and they need preferential treatment. You really cannot treat the riparian area the same way that you treat uplands. They're different. They need different management. They need preferential management and treatment. And then secondly is if the manager can identify whatever it might be that's hindering this natural recovery and then address that hindrance or that thing that's inhibiting the creek from fixing itself. And later in a presentation Nikki's going to give later, she's going to show you what some of these hindering factors are that have been shown that if they continue, the creek will never heal itself. So I'm going to wait and let her show those to you later. But it's a key to understanding how creeks fix themselves. You try to understand what's inhibiting it, and then you deal with that hindrance. This was one of the first workshops we had, and there's Mr. Elmore right there, who came on many times to train us. And Mr. Elmore worked for the federal government for 40 years. He was a career bureaucrat. And here's what he had to say about riparian restoration. He said, "It will not happen by regulation, changes in the law, more money, or any of the normal bureaucratic approaches." In other words, the government is not going to fix the creeks. And that's something coming from a 40-year career federal agency guy. What he said, though, is that it will only occur through the integration of ecological, economic, and social factors and the active participation of affected people. And that's you folks. That's you folks in this room. Government agencies have a role to play, a support role, but it's up to landowners and land managers, you folks in this room, to be the ones that come together as a group, as the Plum Creek Watershed Partnership, or whatever group you might have, to consider these things that we're going to talk about today. And obviously, the reason that all of this is so important is because you are the water managers of Texas. It's not the government. It's not some governmental agency. It's not the Corps of Engineers. It's the people that own the water catchments and the creeks and the riparian areas. And with the right kind of stewardship ethics, we're hoping that more and more landowners will become those conscientious stewards and do a better and better and better job of managing the state's water resources. And so I'm going to end there with this initial sort of introductory type presentation, and we're going to, I think, continue on now with Ryan. I'm going to let you introduce who you are, and I think we'll have a break after Ryan's presentation. So Ryan, if you would come forward.